The smell of apple pie was still in the air when my whole world shifted. I just pulled the pan from the oven, something I hadn't done in over a year, not since my husband passed, and I remember thinking that maybe things were finally turning around. My attorney had called that morning to confirm everything. The sale of my late sister's home in Asheville had closed. The investments, the accounts, the trust she built over 37 years of careful living, all of it had transferred to me. $2.4 million. I was 66 years old. I had more money than I'd ever seen in my life, and I was standing in my kitchen baking a pie because I wanted to celebrate by doing something that felt like her. My sister, Luann, had never married. She put every ounce of herself into her financial planning career, into her little craftsman house in the mountains, into her garden that I could never quite replicate no matter how many times she walked me through it. When she was diagnosed, she called me first. When she needed someone to drive her to chemo, I made the 5-hour trip every single time. We had 3 months together at the end, and I am grateful every day that I was there for all of it. She left everything to me. Her son. I should explain this now, because I know people wonder. Her son Brendan had cut contact with her almost 8 years before she died. A falling out over money, ironically enough. He'd borrowed from her twice, never repaid a cent, and when she finally told him she wouldn't lend anymore, he told her she was dead to him. She changed her will 6 months after that conversation. By the time she passed, she hadn't heard from him in years. I'm not saying he was a bad person. I'm saying Luann made her choice with a clear mind and a full heart, and I honored it. So there I was, 66, widowed, a modest house in Knoxville that needed a new roof, and suddenly financially secure for the first time in my adult life. I was going to tell my son that evening. He and his wife were coming for dinner. They lived about 20 minutes away, and we'd fallen into a routine of Sunday suppers after my husband died. My son Oliver was 41, worked in commercial real estate, always had his eye on the next opportunity. His wife, Trina, was pleasant enough, though we'd never been particularly close. They had 2 kids in elementary school and a mortgage on a house that was, in my private opinion, a little too large for what they actually needed. I had the table set. The pie was cooling. I was humming to myself when I heard tires in the driveway. They were early, which surprised me. I went to the front window and saw their car, but they didn't get out right away. I could see Oliver on the phone through the windshield, and Trina leaning toward him talking. I thought nothing of it. I went back to the kitchen to check on the roast. That was when I heard them come through the side door, the one that opens directly into the kitchen. They didn't know I was standing just around the corner at the stove. She's going to want to give half of it away, Trina was saying. Her voice was low, but not low enough. You know how she is. The church, those charities, your cousin's kids. She'll write checks until there's nothing left. I know, Oliver said. That's why we need to move on this quickly. Your uncle already texted me back. He said a financial power of attorney is the cleanest approach. We just need one doctor to sign off that she's showing signs of cognitive decline, with her age and the grief from losing your dad and now your aunt. We don't need much, Oliver said, just enough to establish concern. And Dr. Whitmore owes you a favor. A silence. Then, yeah, he does. I stood at that stove and I did not move. The burner was on and I did not move. I could not have told you how long I stood there. Long enough for them to walk into the living room, for Oliver to call out Mom, like everything was perfectly normal. Long enough for something inside me to go very, very still. I turned off the burner. I wiped my hands on my dish towel. I walked out and I smiled and I said, "You're early. Good. I could use help with the rolls. I have never in my life worked harder at a smile." Dinner was a performance I didn't know I was capable of. Oliver talked about a commercial property deal he was tracking in Chattanooga. Trina talked about the kids' soccer schedules. I asked questions. I laughed at the right moments. I served the pie and watched them eat it, and I thought carefully and quietly about every word I had just heard. Financial power of attorney. Cognitive decline. Dr. Whitmore owes you a favor. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I thought about my husband's last years, how we'd always meant to do proper estate planning and never quite gotten around to it. I thought about my sister, who had been meticulous about it and protected herself accordingly. And I thought about the fact that I was 66 years old, freshly grieving, and apparently showing enough vulnerability that my own son was already making phone calls. I want to be fair. I have spent a long time trying to be fair about this. Oliver had grown up watching us struggle financially. His father worked hard, but we were never comfortable, not really. I think somewhere in him there was a deep anxiety about money, a hunger for security that twisted into something else when he saw it suddenly sitting within reach. I understand the shape of that fear. I just cannot forgive what he decided to do with it. The next morning, I called my friend Justine. Justine had been my closest friend for 22 years. She was a retired paralegal, sharp as anyone I'd ever met, and she had absolutely no patience for nonsense of any kind. I told her what I'd heard, word for word, as best I could remember it. There was a long silence on her end. "Margaret," she said, then caught herself. "Sorry. I mean, you can call me by my name," I said. "It's just us." "Okay. What I need you to do right now, before anything else, is get yourself a different attorney. Not the one who handled Luann's estate. You need someone who handles elder law specifically. Today, if you can." "I haven't even confirmed what I heard," I said. "What if I misunderstood? Did you mishear the words power of attorney and cognitive decline?" I had not. She helped me find an elder law attorney named Mr. Aldrich, a quiet man in his 60s who'd been practicing in Knoxville for over 30 years and who listened to everything I said without interrupting once. When I finished, he folded his hands on his desk and looked at me steadily. "The good news," he said, "is that you came to me before they made any formal moves. The bad news is that what you're describing is a recognizable pattern, and it tends to accelerate once the person initiating it believes they have a timeline." He explained my options. We began making a plan. In the meantime, I had to keep everything normal. That was the hardest part, harder than the legal maneuvering, harder than the sleepless nights. Oliver called me every few days. He'd always been attentive after his father died, and now I couldn't tell where grief-driven closeness ended and strategy began. Trina started suggesting they come over more often. She brought me casseroles. She asked questions about how I was sleeping, whether I'd been driving at night, whether I'd thought about simplifying, her word, my finances now that I had more to manage. I said I was sleeping fine. I said I drove perfectly well, thank you. I said I had an attorney helping me with the finances. That last one landed differently than I expected. "An attorney?" Trina said very carefully. "Which one?" "A new one," I said pleasantly. Luann always said a person should have a specialist for every area of their life. The casserole stopped after that. About 3 weeks in, Oliver called me on a Tuesday evening and said he'd been thinking, wouldn't it make sense for me to add him to my accounts, just for convenience given how overwhelming this must all be? I could practically hear the script underneath the words. I told him I appreciated the thought, but that Mr. Aldrich had advised me against making any changes to accounts or documents for at least 6 months while the estate settled. "He says it's standard practice," I said. Something about protecting against tax complications. None of that was exactly true, but it bought me time. What I didn't tell Oliver was that I had already done several things. I had updated my will with Mr. Aldrich's guidance, establishing a trust that could not be easily challenged. I had documented my mental fitness, a full cognitive evaluation that I passed without a single flag, results in writing, signed and dated. I had contacted Dr. Whitmore's office directly and left a message noting that I was aware of a potential attempt to obtain documentation suggesting cognitive impairment and that any such documentation would be scrutinized carefully in a legal context. I never heard from Dr. Whitmore. I suspect Oliver heard about that call, and I had started keeping records. Every phone call with Oliver where finances came up, I made notes immediately afterward. Time, date, what was said. Justine had suggested a small digital recorder for in-person conversations, which I kept in my cardigan pocket during their visits. I am not proud of that. I want to say that clearly. I felt sick every time I used it. but I had heard my son's voice in my kitchen making plans to have me declared incompetent, and I needed to be able to prove what I knew. Things came to a head about 6 weeks after that dinner. Oliver called and told me he'd spoken with a doctor. He didn't name Dr. Starge. Whitmore, he was careful about that, who was concerned based on some things Oliver had described. He said he thought it might be a good idea for me to have an evaluation. He said it gently, tenderly, in the voice I remembered from when he was a teenager, asking for things he knew he shouldn't have. He said he was worried about me. He said he just wanted to make sure I was okay. I let him finish. Oliver, I said, I had a cognitive evaluation 4 weeks ago. Full battery. My attorney has the results. I'm going to need you to tell me who this doctor is, and I'm going to need you to understand that I have been aware of what you and Trina have been planning since the night you came to dinner 6 weeks ago. The silence on his end was so complete I could hear traffic outside my window. I stood at that stove, I said, and I heard every word. He tried to deny it at first, then he tried to reframe it. He was just worried. He just wanted to protect me. The conversation I'd overheard had been taken out of context. I let him talk. I didn't argue. When he ran out of words, I told him that I had already taken the steps necessary to protect myself and my assets, that Mr. Aldrich would be contacting his attorney in the coming days, and that I loved him, but that I was no longer willing to pretend this had not happened. His attorney did contact Mr. Aldrich, as it turned out, before Mr. Aldrich could reach out. Oliver, advised by counsel, had decided to file for guardianship preemptively, apparently believing he could still establish his case before I could shut it down. He was wrong. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late February. I remember the drive there. Justine took me, refused to let me go alone. It was cold and gray, and the courthouse parking lot was full of puddles from the rain the night before. I wore the blue wool coat I'd had for 15 years, the one my husband always said made me look like I meant business. Oliver was already inside with his attorney when we arrived. He didn't look at me when I walked in. What followed was not dramatic in the way you might picture. There was no shouting, no revelations from the stand, nothing like the courtroom scenes you see on television. It was quiet and procedural and devastating in the way that only official things can be. Mr. Aldrich presented the cognitive evaluation. He presented documentation of my financial decisions since inheriting, careful, considered, fully within normal parameters. He presented a statement from my primary care physician of 9 years, confirming she had observed no signs of cognitive impairment in our regular appointments. Oliver's attorney presented a letter from a doctor I'd never met, based on a second-hand account of my behavior from Oliver. The judge read it. She set it down. She looked at Oliver's attorney over her reading glasses and asked a single question. Had his client's mother been examined by this physician directly? She had not. The petition was denied. Costs were awarded to me. Walking out of that building, I felt something I can only describe as a rearrangement. Not happiness, exactly. Not relief, though relief was part of it. More like the sensation of standing up straight after being hunched over something for a very long time. Justine squeezed my arm in the parking lot. "Apple pie," she said. "I think I've earned something stronger," I said. In the months that followed, I did not contact Oliver. His attorney sent a brief letter, an acknowledgement, not an apology, and I filed it in the same folder as the hearing documents and set the folder in the back of my filing cabinet. Trina sent a text message once, something about the children missing me. I read it several times. I did not respond. I think about what I would say to him if we ever spoke again. I've rehearsed it, lying awake at 2 in the morning. Some nights I rehearse something gracious. Some nights I rehearse something honest. Most nights I land somewhere in the middle. I would tell him that I understand the fear and that I do not understand the choice. What I did instead was build. I had Luann's money, and I had my own intact sense of judgment, and I had Justine, and I had Mr. Mitter. Aldrich and I turned out to have considerably more resilience than anyone had apparently accounted for. I had the roof repaired. I set up a trust for 2 of my nieces on my late husband's side, who were putting themselves through school with very little help. I made a donation to the hospice that had cared for Luann in her final weeks. The nurses there had been extraordinary, and I'd always wanted to do something meaningful for them. I started a small container garden on my back porch. Nothing like Luann's. I am not her but mine. Tomatoes, herbs, one ambitious attempt at zucchini that took over more space than I intended. I have her handwritten notes on a clipboard I hang by the back door. Some people ask, gently, whether I'll ever reconnect with my son. I tell them honestly, I don't know. The door is not locked, but I'm also not the same woman who stood at that stove frozen with shock. That woman would have eventually talked herself into forgiveness as a form of self-erasure, would have smoothed everything over to keep the peace, would have quietly handed over pieces of herself to avoid conflict. She wouldn't have called Justine the next morning. She wouldn't have walked into Mr. Aldrich's office with her hands shaking and her chin up. I am still her, but I also am not. Last month I drove up to Asheville for the weekend, the first time since Luann's estate settled. I didn't drive past her old house. I thought I might, but when the moment came, I kept going. I went to the farmer's market instead. I bought honey and a cutting board made by a man who'd been working the same booth for 12 years. I sat at a little cafe and drank the best cup of coffee I've had in recent memory and watched the mountains be mountains. On the drive home, I called Justine from the car. I told her about the honey and the coffee and the cutting board. "Are you okay?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. The road was clear. The afternoon light was doing something remarkable to the ridgeline. "I'm really okay," I said, and I meant it in the fullest possible sense, not as reassurance, not as performance, but as a simple fact that had finally, honestly come true. I've thought a lot about the word deserve since all of this happened. People use it so easily. She deserved better. He got what he deserved. And I understand the impulse. There's something deeply human about wanting the ledger to balance. But what I've come to believe, sitting with everything that unfolded, is that the ledger doesn't balance because of fate or luck or some invisible hand keeping score. It balances because of choices, small ones, made in moments no one else sees. Oliver made his choice in a car in my driveway, thinking I wasn't listening. I made mine at a stove in my kitchen, deciding not to pretend I hadn't heard. Neither of us knew in that moment what would follow, but every single thing that came after grew directly from those two choices. That's what I want people to understand when I tell this story. Not that evil is punished and good is rewarded in some tidy, reliable way. I'm 66 years old, and I know the world doesn't always work like that. What I mean is that the choices you make when no one is watching are exactly the choices that build or destroy you. Oliver chose to treat his mother as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. And from that one choice, a whole architecture of consequences followed. Naturally, inevitably, the way water follows a slope. I think about Justine a lot. She picked up the phone that morning and she didn't minimize what I told her. Didn't say, "Are you sure you heard right?" Or maybe he didn't mean it that way. She took me seriously. That's a form of love that doesn't get enough credit, the kind that trusts your judgment, that stands beside you without needing to soften the edges of a hard truth. I wouldn't have found Mr. Aldrich without her. I wouldn't have walked into that courtroom with documentation tight enough to close every door Oliver's attorney tried to open. Justine is not a dramatic person. She's just steady, and steady turned out to be exactly what I needed. What I keep coming back to is this: I was not special. I didn't do anything remarkable. I was a 66-year-old woman who'd baked a pie and heard something terrible, and I had to decide what to do next. The decision to act, to call Justine, to find an attorney, to sit through those Sunday suppers with a smile I didn't feel, that came from somewhere I didn't fully know I had. You don't find out what you're made of in the good moments. You find out in the kitchen, with the burner on, when everything you thought you knew about your family has just shifted under your feet. Luann knew what she was doing when she left everything to me. Not because I was wealthier or more successful. I wasn't either of those things. But she'd watched me for 66 years, and she trusted my character. That trust became the thing I most wanted to prove worthy of. If there's any lesson in what happened, I think it's that. The real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the belief that I was someone who could be trusted with it. Honoring that, protecting it, fighting for it, refusing to let it be taken by fear or greed or someone else's bad choices. That was the work, and I did it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but I did it. The container garden is doing well this year, by the way. The tomatoes are coming in earlier than I expected.